Okay, my light is on and my mics are working. Thank you all for coming to this talk and panel. This is really a great turnout, and we're very excited to see so many people. I'm even more nervous to be up here than I normally would be because I've noticed that there are at least 5 farmers in the audience. That really raises the bar for what I need to say. And people from Athens. There's like a lot of more expectations for my performance. My name is Kat Becker, and I'm a lecturer in sociology here at UW Marathon County, and I'm also tonight's panel moderator. I want to thank you for your interest and support in the Institute, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Services 2010 programming. And it was made possible not only by the folks that are sitting here today who will provide some interesting information, but also by the Wisconsin Humanities Council, the University of Wisconsin Colleges, UW Extension, and the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Services. Our talk today, if you didn't see the title when you were walking in, is the Stewardship of Eaters and Providers, How Sustainable Agriculture Builds Community. And hopefully this panel presentation will get to the underlying ideas about how a new model for agrarian farming encourages an economy of use and return and promotes family coherence, neighborliness, and local community. Or does it, I guess, will be part of the question. I'd also like to invite you all to the next Building Communities event. That's the theme that we're using this semester, or this year at UW Marathon County. And so the next event is a week from tonight at 7 p.m., so be here, same day, different topic. It's going to be about community development in the arts. And art activist Mario Ewell of Colorado Council on Arts and the Robert Gard Wisconsin Idea Foundation board member, as well as Eric, and I'm going to butcher his last name, I'm sure, Takashita, senior programming officer with the Minneapolis-St. Paul office of the Local Initiative to Support Corporation, and former senior policy aide to the mayor of Minneapolis's 10-year strategic plan for arts and culture. We'll discuss the current efforts to build arts community capacity, and UWMC professor emerita of English and Wisconsin Art Board member Linda Ware will moderate the discussions. We will have this panel discussion and engage with some interesting information. We'll follow that with a time for questions, so if you have questions that arise anytime during this presentation, please feel free to jot them down, and we'll take those at the end. And then please join us afterward right down the hallway that direction for an informal discussion with folks in the audience as well as panelists, and some cookies and coffees and water, and there's usually juice as well. So thank you again for coming. Today's roster include Eric Booz, who is going to speak more extensively, and I'll let him introduce himself since I am not fully familiar with all of his academic work. He's a philosophy professor at Fond du Lac as well as an organic farmer. Craig Carlson, who sits next to him, is a grazer, which he can let you know what that is a little bit, here in Marathon County, and raises many different types of animals on pasture. Next to him is Kevin Corpella, who is one of the owners and people who makes Downtown Grocery, which is our local downtown grocery, happen. And he will be talking more about that venue, which obviously isn't a farm, but really engages with local agriculture. Next to him is Tony Schultz, who's the owner and operator of Stony Acres Farm in Athens. He's also my husband. That's my conflict of interest disclaimer. And I'm sure he's going to make a joke about it, so I thought I'd get it in first. And next to him is Paul Whitaker, who's a professor of biology and an entomologist here at UW Marathon County, who's done extensive research in organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture and continues to do so today. So they have some interesting insights from all of their perspectives. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to give you a little bit of an introduction. Go ahead.
Do I push this down?
Does he need to push that? No.
Hi, I'm Eric Boos. I currently teach philosophy at the University of Wisconsin Fond du Lac campus. I'm also an attorney, but that doesn't make me all bad. And I'm also an organic farmer. And so I come at this topic from 3 different perspectives. Tonight I'd like to focus a little bit, though, on the philosophical perspective in setting this up. At first, when I was invited to participate, I was thoroughly excited about the possibility because I thought I could come here and represent the eaters. But then it occurred to me philosophically, well, gee, everyone's an eater. I'm just really gifted. So I don't want to come here and brag about my abilities, but I'm a really, really good eater. So in lieu of talking about my ability to eat, I'm going to focus a little bit on the philosophy of eating. And what I want to talk about is basically the epistemology of eating. Now, epistemology is a big word, and it doesn't mean all that. It just means how do we know what we know, and how does human knowledge relate to the activity of eating? And I'm fascinated by this subject because as a philosopher, one of our most important philosophers in the history of the Western tradition is Plato. And in fact, Plato begins his most famous work, The Republic, by elaborating on a scheme which he says is true of all human societies, anytime, any place, everywhere. And that scheme is that we all begin from the perspective of eaters. In fact, Plato says that the basis for all human society is the fact that we need to eat. Plato says that the mother of invention is necessity. And of course, then in the Republic, in Book 2, he says the first necessity that we all face is eating. And so the structure of human civil society is basically based on eating, our need to eat. And out of that, Plato derives certain conclusions, which I think we see reflected in the history of American agriculture, and that's why I think it's really important. The other reason I want to begin by talking about Plato a little bit is because not only does he give us, I think, the best philosophical perspective, but our goal tonight is to actually talk about how sustainable approaches to agriculture builds community. And the reason that Plato becomes important is because he says the traditional approach that humans follow, which is geared towards efficiency, geared towards satisfying our basic necessities, always trying to invent easier ways to feed ourselves, according to Plato, that always results in the disruption of human community. In fact, in the first 4 books of Plato's Republic, he sets out a basic structure of human society that moves from subsistence agriculture to cooperative agriculture, because humans are reasoning beings, and so we figure out very quickly that if we work together trying to feed ourselves, we do a much better job. We experience more efficiency. So we move from subsistence agriculture to cooperative agriculture. And then when we're engaged in cooperative agriculture, Plato makes the claim that humans will always see things as though specialization is the best way to achieve the end. And so as human beings living in civil society, we will start parceling out the various jobs needed to create the kind of economy and the kind of agriculture we need to live well. And when we parcel out those jobs and make them specializations, we have greater levels of efficiency. However, when you start compartmentalizing human society, you start disrupting the community itself. And that's the backdrop that I'd like to use for the bulk of what I want to present. The problem with the social arrangement is that humans recognize almost intuitively that all things produced that we need for our sustenance can be done so in a better way, as far as efficiency is concerned, by individuals. And so we set up educational structures which also are geared towards efficiency. The problem with efficient agriculture is it may not, in the long run, be effective agriculture. If we understand basic nutrition and health as components of agriculture, then what we see very clearly in our own experience as a society is that efficient agriculture is not necessarily effective agriculture. It's not effective in the sense that the basic health needs are compromised. It's not effective in the sense that the community relationships are somehow compromised. We end up with a society of specialization, of specialists, and the integrated nature of the social fabric is damaged. And that really is amazing to me as a philosopher, because that was 350 BC that Plato laid that out. And he goes on in books 3 and 4 to say, once your society becomes so efficient at meeting its needs, a peculiar phenomena will occur, and that phenomena is leisure. Once we gain a certain level of efficiency at meeting the basic need of having to eat, we start having leisure time. And herein lies the rub, according to Plato. Humans, by nature, will not use their leisure time to develop themselves as human beings in the most productive ways. In fact, when humans gain leisure time, they'll start to engage in aberrant behaviors which actually detract from their overall health, that actually detract from the overall symbiotic nature that human community should have otherwise. They'll actually engage in behaviors which are disruptive of community. Why that's the case, Plato doesn't say, but I think if you look at the historical trend and the development of agriculture even within the United States, you'll see that certainly something Plato was writing about is true in our own experience. As we become more highly specialized and integrate more levels of technology, we are more efficient, but we end up with leisure time that is not used productively for the natural end of humans in society. It actually becomes kind of a weight around our neck, and we're not responsible in that fashion. I'll give a couple of examples of that if I may. But let's talk a little bit more about Plato's ideas. Once leisure creeps into the social structure, people will begin to expand on their desires. And the first area that people will expand upon their desires, according to Plato, is in the area of nutrition. They will no longer be concerned with just meeting the basic needs of their body. They will now take on an appetite for things they've never experienced. Plato calls these relishes. When there's leisure, people want diversity in their food. They want variety in their food. They want spicy foods. They want rich foods. They want expensive foods. That's the nature of the human person, says Plato. Meet your basic needs, and once that's assured, you start developing an interest for things that may not be in your best interest, but we can't seem to curb that habit, says Plato. It's a natural progression. Now, Plato's not alone in this. Several contemporary authors, especially here in the United States, have really latched on to the notion of sustainability and are really arguing that sustainability is the only way to build community, and what we have had as an agricultural model has been absolutely disruptive of community. Authors such as Thomas Lyson traces the Platonic progression in America in his book, Civic Agriculture. Lyson shows in great detail the shift from subsistence agriculture to cooperative agriculture to contemporary production-based agribusiness. The same progression that Plato predicted in 350 BC of all human civilization played itself out exactly in that way here in the United States. Lyson highlights the attendant trades and economies of scale that developed around agriculture during the various paradigm shifts from subsistence to cooperative to modern-day agribusiness. And those paradigm shifts have seen a trend in the United States. In 1910, there were 6.3 million farmers in America and only 6,000 tractors. 1997, there were 2.1 million farmers and 4 million tractors. Now, on the surface of things, that's a wonderful paradigm shift because it allows a higher level of efficiency. But what is behind the scene, as Plato might ask? What's really going on? When your number of farmers drops from 6.3 million down to 2 million, but your number of tractors goes from 6,000 to 4 million, there has to be some other social cost that we've not bothered to evaluate. The number of acres during that same time period from 1910 to 1997 remained roughly the same, while production rates soared. Technical innovation was very helpful to the process, but we also might consider that a 10,000% increase in fertilizer during that time period also helped. And I don't want to dwell on the point, but that 10,000% increase in fertilizer might not necessarily have been the best thing for us. The paradigm shift has also led to a serious concentration of agricultural commodities, land, and resources. In 1910, the average farmer included at least 4 different kinds of livestock, and more than half of those farmers included at least 6 kinds of livestock. There were at least 10 varieties of plants being grown on the average farm in 1910. By 1997, those numbers changed to 1 kind of livestock on each farm and 3 or fewer varieties of plants. So we've seen an absolute drop-off in the diversity of our farming. Now, on the surface, again, you might say, well, that's okay because, monocropping leads to higher levels of efficiency. We can feed more people today than we used to be able to. But Plato's in the background taunting us and asking us, how has it been good for community? How has it been good for the biodiversity necessary to sustain life on the planet? How has it been good for the economies of scale? Other things we might want to consider from Lyson's book, the number of farmers was decreasing steadily. From 1974 to 1997, the number of farms with more than $500,000 per year in income increased by 600%. So what we see is a consolidation of farming. It's falling into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Is the efficiency there? Yes. But is the effectiveness there? The question that's going to haunt us from Plato is this really effective in terms of human community? $1 million per year farm operations, which represent only 1.4% of all farms, control more than 40% of all farm sales in the United States. So we have far fewer people producing far more than ever before, which on the surface you might call efficiency, but what's behind that? Behind that, according to Plato, according to Lyson, according to other authors such as Michael Pollan, is an absolute disruption of community. We're losing the community ties that were once there, that were centered on agriculture. Now, one thing that Plato would make clear, I think, is he's going to say, look, this is not some kind of vast conspiracy to deprive people of this livelihood or take people out of it. It's human nature. We pursue efficiency because it's what we are geared to do. If there's a more efficient way, we do it. It's not that we are malcontents and trying to disrupt community purposely. It's that we get confused as humans. And we don't see putting in more effort as being in any way sustainable. We confuse sustainability with efficiency. And so the notion that we're trying to pursue, at least tonight, in a very real way and in a philosophical way, is how can we make it the case that we've come to understand sustainability as the more effective way of approaching agriculture and human community? How can we move away from models of efficiency, which in the long run are actually going to be damaging to human community? And that's the context that we're working on, I think. More that we could say about Plato is he predicted this of all societies, not just American society. I think you can look around the world. I've had the benefit of living in Tanzania, East Africa for many years, and helped start a college there, and we have a sustainable college which grows all of its own food and meets all of its own energy needs. And the last time I visited, the administration was already talking about paring off some of the tasks of the college, like growing vegetables and hiring workers. And I said, no, this is exactly the temptation that humans face according to Plato, and once you do that, you're going to lose something. And I had a hard time convincing them that they should stay the course and keep the college diverse and keep everybody active in that sustainable pattern. There's a real human temptation for us to try to specialize the work and farm it out to people who can focus on those things only. Plato said it very simply. He says, look, when the farmer has to make his own plow, he can't farm as well because he's distracted. So better to have plow makers and every other attendant kind of equipment that farmers would need. But then the question comes again, what's the price that we actually pay when we specialize too much? On that account, and based on the human nature that I'm describing from Plato, and it's been reiterated by the contemporary authors, I think, quite well in light of the American agriculture experience, I perceive that there's actually a new food crisis. It's not the food crisis that's referred to, on the global level of 2 billion people in the world going hungry every day. I think the food crisis is something a lot different. In fact, I would point to the fact that there are many Americans who are grossly overfed and suffering from malnutrition at the same time. That seems to me to be a real food crisis, or at least a different food crisis than we have been focusing on. In a manner of speaking, the food crisis in America, at least in my view as a philosopher and as a farmer, is the fact that 1 in 5 meals today will be eaten in a car. I see that as a food crisis. Okay, I don't see that in any way contributing to the wealth of knowledge about the value of nutrition and diet. I see it as problematic. I see that in a sense that when we approach food that way, we develop a contempt for it. We're no longer connected to our food sources, our food supplies, and we develop a contempt for it, which I think has other social ramifications. For instance, 1 out of 3 children in America today will eat fast food. 1 in 3 children born after the year 2000 will develop type 2 diabetes. That can't be a good outcome from all of our agricultural efficiency. We're the only nation on earth that's facing that gross statistic. 30% of our population is struggling with obesity. We have the highest rates of cancer, heart disease, asthma, diabetes, and many other medical maladies in the world. 1 out of every $6 in America is spent on health care. And the leading problem within health care is obesity. That's all food related. It's all community based. So something is not quite right with all of our efficiency. Yes, we've achieved fantastic things in agriculture, but these statistics seem to indicate there's something more to the problem. I again would call this the new food crisis. On top of that, as I mentioned, I think that when food comes so easily to us as humans, that we develop a contempt for it. I think that's reflected in the fact that every year in the United States, we throw away 96.2 billion pounds of processed food. All you have to do is visit one of your local all-you-can-eat buffets and see how much food goes into the garbage. Now, that's problematic from a couple of perspectives. Number one, because we lose empathy for people who are actually hungry. Number two, the amount of fossil fuels and things necessary to even make that possible logistically is a tremendous waste of resource. Just to give you some kind of picture of how much food that actually is, I read one study that said the amount, by the USDA no less, 96.2 billion pounds of food is enough to fill up semi-trucks, 8 lanes wide, bumper to bumper, from New York to Los Angeles. That's just the food that we can calculate that's thrown away in garbage at university cafeterias or all-you-can-eat buffets or in average households. So there's something, I think, that's quite wrong. And I think that phenomena is indicative of the fact that we've lost a sense of community, certainly a sense of global community. When 2 billion people don't have enough food to eat every day, and yet as a nation we can throw away 96.2 billion pounds per year, we've lost something in terms of human community. All of this can be seen as the result, I think, of the grand push towards specialization and efficiency, a push, again, which Plato says is natural. It's not something that's conspiratorial in nature. It's human nature. We're flawed in a sense, and we're not doing anything to correct our own mentalities. Necessity is the mother of invention, says Plato, and so we invent more efficient ways to meet the necessity of eating. But this push towards specialization leads precisely to the disconnection between people and the food chain that has resulted in this new global crisis. The new crisis, as it were, has been complicated by the adoption of corporate capitalism, which embraces neuromarketing. Neuromarketing is basically epistemology, as I mentioned. The structure of my presentation is about epistemology and eating. And neuromarketing studies how people think, and then they exploit that fact to make more money. Neuromarketing is used as a means of inducing consumers to buy and eat what they know to be less than healthy. As Michael Pollan points out in his book, Omnivore's Dilemma, the average supermarket in America has about 40,000 products, half of which contain high fructose corn syrup and other corn and soy products, and this fact contributes to the monocropping and the culture of agribusiness. And many of those foods are subsidized. And so there's going to be a trend to continue to do more of the same. We're interested, I think, in breaking that trend, getting our thought process changed. But that is going to be a tough sell because the neuromarketers and those interested in capitalist ventures and profit, they don't necessarily share the view of others. Consumers are, as Plato points out, of humans in general, weak-minded and slaves to their appetites. Recently, a Wall Street Journal article by John Lehrer pointed out some really fascinating studies in his article, Blame It on the Brain. He cites a Stanford study which required individuals to memorize a certain set of numbers. Some individuals were required to memorize 7 numbers. Some individuals at the same time were required to memorize only 2 numbers. Then they were told to go out of the room, walk down the hall, go into another room, and report those numbers. But here's how they complicated the study. It was a study on the human mind and moral decision-making. When they left the room, some of them thinking about 7 numbers, some of them thinking about 2 numbers, they were stopped in the hallway by a young lady who then offered them a choice between a big piece of chocolate cake or a dish of fruit. Here's the fascinating aspect of that study. People who were required to remember 7 digits chose the cake 2-to-1 over people who are required to memorize 2 digits. That's really important science in terms of how the human brain functions. In other words, what it says is when we have a lot of things to focus on, our willpower becomes exceedingly weak. Not true of everyone, but of about 70% of people in America, when we have a lot on our mind, our willpower to make good, healthy choices is severely weakened. That is a very telling statistic. There are similar reports, according to Laura. For instance, at the University of Michigan, they found that subjects who were just walking down a crowded city street, it reduced their measures of self-control because of all the stimuli that were in their cerebral cortex. Perhaps most disconcerting is the fact that willpower also requires real energy. In a study at Florida State University, students required to exert self-control for 3 hours had significantly lower glucose levels than students who didn't have to exert self-control. Here's the problem. The more we try to exert self-control, the more natural sugars we use because it takes energy. Well, then that sends a signal to the brain that says you just expended a lot of energy, you need to replace it. So exerting self-control will actually drive us to want to eat more. So what if your self-control is being applied to a diet that you're on? It's a self-defeating proposition because the harder you work at it, the more energy you expend, the more your body is telling you, you got to replace that. So there's something more to the equation. It's why many diet plans fail. There's something else we have to think about. But make no mistake about it. I mean, several philosophers have said this, including Epicurus and St. Augustine and Thomas Hobbes. And the axiom is basically true, I think, for all humans, that the faster we satisfy our desires, the more those desires increase. So you end up with food addictions and many other addictions. But look at the structure of how we eat. Again, 1 in 5 meals in America today will be eaten in a car. So what will that do to the human psyche and our approach to food? The faster we can satisfy our desires, the greater they will increase. That's a kind of a philosophical axiom that's been around for a long time. Marketing strategists are aware of this, and they use neuromarketing and epistemology to encourage shoppers to buy the junk foods and the unhealthy foods, which isn't too difficult given the natural moral weakness, which Aristotle called akrasia, that humans display in their moral decision-making process. Paralyze the rational self with a plethora of choices, and appetites will win out in spite of our knowledge of nutrition and diet. Even worse, if we increase the portion and serving sizes of the junk foods, humans develop a bigger desire for them. The Baskin-Robbins ice cream franchise figured this out many years ago. I remember this when I was younger. They were the first ice cream shop to advertise 33 flavors. That was phenomenal. Well, what was the method behind their madness? Why do you need 33 flavors? Well, what they figured out was if you could paralyze people by too many options, they were more than likely to order a double dip cone. So the more choices you gave them, the more they were paralyzed by choice, and when they were forced with a moral decision, how much do you want? More people than not ordered a double dip cone because they wanted one of a different kind of flavor. And that was neuroscience back then. It's still in effect today, and it's still being used regularly. Now, foregoing an ethical analysis of the marketing methods, which is something to be considered in business ethics classes, if you have knowledge that people are basically morally weak and you can confuse them with choices, is that right? That's a huge issue. But we'll forego that and turn to a consideration instead of the implications for the organic and the green and the sustainable movements. While specialization and the concentration of resources and commodities have undoubtedly boosted our agricultural efficiency, we face this new kind of global food crisis, which, if we are to solve it, will require fundamental change in the way we approach our food and a fundamental change in the American food system. And I do call it a food system because system actually comes from the Latin word for sewer. And I think that's kind of where we're at with our food system. People are paralyzed by the options before them and therefore likely to make bad and unhealthy choices. It's no surprise then that we are faced with an epidemic of obesity. We're paralyzing people with the options we put in front of them. It's no surprise also that if you go into a grocery store, there's usually only one kind of broccoli, but there's 30 kinds of soda. So where are we causing people to focus their energy and their effort? And also, it's no coincidence that broccoli is probably $1.29 or $1.39 for a clump of 3, and soda or by the liter is probably 99 cents. That also plays into people's rational deliberation. So the agenda is slanted one way. Authors such as Michael Pollan in Omnivore Dilemma and in his other book, Defense of Food, Thomas Lyson in his book, Civic Agriculture, Patricia Allen in her book, Together at the Table, and Marion Nestle in her book, Food Politics, all write about this new crisis and all generally acknowledge the epistemological root of the problem. They all also propose basically the same remedy. I think it's the remedy that we've hit upon by even convening this meeting tonight, and that is reconnecting producers and consumers through education. The only way we're going to counterbalance that side of the equation is to give people new and better knowledge about what's good for them. We can't predict that it's ultimately going to win, but we have to start somewhere. With that in mind, what many thinkers have proposed and what we achieve by virtue of this very conference is an enlightening enlightenment regarding basic nutrition in the food system. We have to reestablish the connection between growers and eaters so that eaters have enough positive ideas to counterbalance the moral weakness of the mind that occurs naturally. We must encourage a cultural emphasis on effective agriculture over and above efficient agriculture. In other words, we must work to reverse the natural human trend that Plato wrote about and move away from specialization and diversification. Maybe more labor intensive, but gee, with a global economic collapse, we got a lot of people who need jobs, so it might be a match made in heaven. We know that this is also more suitable for agriculture in the long haul, though it might in the short term be less profitable than production-oriented agriculture. In the long haul, it's going to be just as profitable. In short, we must develop a new epistemology of sustainability, as Patricia Allen calls it in her book, Together at the Table. And we must counterbalance those unhealthy alternatives with an abiding knowledge of nutrition, health, diet. That's going to involve establishing linking institutions. By way of example, a linking institution is any community-supported agricultural endeavor where you're actually getting people connected, the eaters and the growers. And that's the basic idea that we have to pursue for the physical and the moral health of our nation. With that, I'll close and we'll move on to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. I really appreciated that, and it also fortunately links in. We've all been working at a distance, or at least Eric and I, and so we were just guessing at what each other were going to talk about. So good thing it worked out. Eric's focus is on the philosophical and moral roots of human decisions, which as a sociologist I really appreciate because I almost always focus on social structures as the cause of everything. But there are other reasons that his talk is timely, not just because of the food crisis that he mentions, not just because of the burgeoning sustainable agriculture movement, but because of the way in which the problems that both rural communities and eaters are experiencing are at the forefront of what's going on with national policy. This past week, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack, released a report in which he identified several problems in the U.S. agricultural systems. I think there were 5 overall, but 2 of those were, 1, a lack of appreciation for farmers, and 2, that there was a crisis in terms of people's access to nutritious food and the obesity epidemic. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture is not well known for supporting sustainable agriculture, and certainly in his report he did not connect the 2 or set forth a way to reconcile many of the problems. But hopefully what this panel will do is show one way that at least what's going on with sustainable agriculture in this region may allow farmers and eaters to reconceptualize communities around food, feed people better, and also allow for farmers to be appreciated at the same time. So what we will proceed to do is, I have a list of questions here. We'll see how many we can get through, but think about the ideas of community and sustainability overall. And what I wanted to do, and my introductions were obviously rather short, is give each of the panelists the chance to talk about what their farm operation or sustainable business or role in sustainable agriculture is, since we have quite a diversity of folks here. And if you are a farmer, I'd like for you to mention what you produce and who eats it. Or in Kevin's case, if you own a grocery store, what do you sell and who eats it? So go ahead, Craig, would you like to go first? Pick on you.
My name is Craig Carlson. I'm a farmer. I grow livestock in a managed intensive grazing system. We graze approximately 80 acres.
A bit closer to the microphone.
Or they can turn it up a little. Thanks.
It's an intensive grazing operation. We pasture our livestock on 70 or 80 permanent acres of grass. I move the animals, 2 groups of animals every day, so every 24 hours, sometimes more often during the day, sometimes every 2 or 3 hours, so that they get fresh grass every couple of hours or every 24 hours, and then they move to a fresh paddock. And I rotate them throughout my pastures throughout the whole summer. We do raise some poultry, and those too are raised on pasture, small movable pens.
My name is Kevin Coppola, and I co-own Downtown Grocery. And what we sell is we sell groceries and a large diversity of local and organic products, with always a growing concern for how we can effectively spend you could say our time or our dollars, and directing staff to seek more local options to make choices where we'll displace those things we get from somewhere else, so that we can have things that are as close to home as possible. As you probably can imagine, that actually takes time, and that of course that takes money, but we would rather work out processes so that we can more effectively bring forth more locality to the food choices that we have. It's actually a huge logistical concern on much phone time and research and conversations. Yet to find that blend of products, in short, our grocery store in the end, it is very small, and we can only support, you could say, we sell, say, a lot of tomatoes, but at the same time, at some point we will hope to support, say, 12 farmers and all their tomatoes, but at the moment we're not quite at that stage, but incrementally we increase as best we can those things that we offer. And the part 2 is that whom eats those things that we have is actually a quite diversity of peoples who do shop at our Downtown Grocery. Speaking with a friend recently, a very knowledgeable, intelligent fellow, and he asked a simple question: is that perhaps the economic concerns as of late are probably not too much of a concern for you, because the nature of your store and the nature of your those that seek your product are probably on the affluent side, and therefore knowing that they're more affluent, therefore their ability to purchase the products in your store without effect. But of course that unfortunately is not true at all, in that the diversity of our clients are very broad ranging in all income classes, all education levels. So it's perhaps not it's an education in the sense of schooling or academic side, but it's an education of an awareness. So we feel rather fortunate that in the going on 4 years now, on the diversity of peoples that we see who seek to eat the things in which we offer.
My name is Tony Schulten with CAT. We own Stony Acres Farm, which is a community-supported agriculture operation. And for anyone not familiar with CSAs, it's basically an economic and social model in which farmers and eaters connect directly. So it's a direct marketing operation. People buy a share in the season's produce before the season begins, and then every week we deliver a box of fresh seasonal organic produce to people's neighborhoods. And in addition to that, we graze beef similar to how Craig operates an intensive grazing system on 90 acres of pasture. And we use those animals in, I think, a very harmonious way with our vegetable operation. So their manure is one source of fertility for our farm. We feed vegetable waste back to the cows, pigs, and chickens. And there's that symbiotic, harmonious relationship going on there. Other sustainable methods, we use a lot of cover cropping. We're very watchful of our soil fertility and building that through the use of closed source nutrients, cover cropping and fertility and animal nutrients. And we're constantly looking to decrease the energy usage of our farm and looking for sustainable, renewable means to provide the energy that we do use, and so looking to investing in solar to enhance the sustainability of our farm.
Who do you sell to?
Oh, we are intensely local. We sell to people from Medford to Wausau, and we live in between. So everything we sell is to our CSA subscribers, through the Wausau Farmers Market, or to local restaurants.
My name is Paul Whitaker. I'm in the biology department here. As the other speakers were speaking, I was thinking if I had ever sold anything to anyone, and I realized I had sold 2 used cars and 1 house. But just about everything else that's surplus for me, I either throw away or I donate or I give away. In terms of my interest in sustainable agriculture, in the late 80s, I was a volunteer with a nonprofit that worked in the border cities in Mexico, and I ran a family gardens project, worked with low-income women in the shanty towns in Tijuana, which is right next to San Diego, and taught them basically small-scale organic vegetable growing skills so that they could supplement their family's diet. From there, I went to graduate school in Madison. My master's project in entomology was working with small, struggling dairy farmers, and the project's goal was to see if it was possible for them to grow an occasional crop of potatoes to sell locally. And by growing potatoes far from other places that were growing potatoes, the thought was they'd be far from any source of diseases and pests that would attack the crop. And so they could grow them with many fewer inputs of chemicals. From there, when I finished that project, I went on to my PhD project, which was looking at ecological ways of controlling pests in an organic apple orchard in southwest Wisconsin. From there, I came here where most of my role is teaching, but I still do occasional outreach presentations to organic farming conferences, to grower groups, to farming field days, primarily focusing on ecological insect pest management, which is an area of interest to me. And recently I started working with a researcher in Madison where we've got a USDA grant, and my share of that grant allows me to work with a couple of undergraduate students each year doing on-farm organic pest management research. And we've been fortunate to do some work with Kat and Tony at their farm and also at a local community garden here in Wausau as one of our field sites. And in terms of community and sustainable agriculture, one of the other things that I did as a graduate student in Madison while I was land poor and time rich, I guess, I got involved in community gardening just as a community gardener. And that's something that some of you may be familiar with, but in many cities there are small plots of land, vacant strips, places where a building's been torn down, land along a railroad track. And that land gets made available to people who get organized and arrange for tillage and soil amendments, and then small plots are given or rented very cheaply to people to grow their own food. And I was part of a organization that ran a garden like that and was a gardener and helped feed my family through that garden. So I'm more interested in, I guess my connection to this is as a do-it-yourselfer, an avid gardener, and an educator to help facilitate people to grow things sustainably, locally.
Thanks, Paul. Any other comments? Craig, I'm going to pick on you because I forgot to ask you who you sell things to or who eats your food.
I direct market everything that I grow. I am also a vendor at the Wausau Farmers Market. I sell 100% grass-fed beef there, cuts or in larger portions, and I also market my chickens and turkeys through there. I have on-farm sales or sales at the farmer's market. And most of it is all local.
Okay. So this semester, or I guess this year, UWMC students, and many of you are probably here that are UWMC students, because perhaps you are getting credit from a class or somebody's coerced you into coming here because it's attached to the theme, but we're reading Bill McKibben's book, Deep Economy. And so how many people in this room have read this book? So that's a good number. Some of you assigned, others because you're interested in it. In Deep Economy and in some of his other writing, Bill McKibben has discussed the way in which eating locally, and specifically he sees locality as a central part of sustainability for a year. So he ate locally for a year, very, very locally, and how this venture gave him a stronger connection to his community for two primary reasons. And he says that eating locally gave him a real understanding of his geography, where he was located, and an understanding of the earth and the world around him in a way that buying food at the grocery store would not have, because he had to understand the seasons and what things actually could and could not be produced there. But also, it created a larger community for him because he had to reach out to people that he didn't know. So he had to find farmers to supply his food, find information on gardening and preserving things from other people. And so in relocalizing his eating, he expanded his community. And he really sees the localization of agriculture as a tool toward enriching community. What I hope to glean from the panelists is, from your experience, how has your farm or your experiences, so in a community garden or in a downtown grocery space, intersected with community? Do you think that it creates a stronger food community or community between farmers and eaters? And you're certainly welcome to say no, but in either case, I'd like just some examples or insights from your own experiences. And I'm going to start with Paul, and we'll go back the other direction. You know.
Man, what a curveball. Well, let's see. So in terms of community gardens, community is a central part of that name. If that group of people does not get together as a group, there's not the critical mass, there's not the labor that's necessary to maybe install a water system, to arrange for a farmer with a tractor and some tillage equipment to come in and prepare the soil, to get compost delivered to improve the soil in those plots. And as people work together on a common goal, even if the goal is so that you each have your own individual plot to grow vegetables for your family, for your friends, that collective working together really builds community. The community garden that I was a part of in Madison, like many community gardens, including the one here in Wausau, a large number of the gardeners were Southeast Asian, and in large part, at least when I was gardening in Madison, this was again about 15 years ago, most of the Southeast Asian gardeners were the older women who spoke very little English. And obviously language differences makes the building of community a bit of a challenge, but since you're all out there working at the same time, everybody's got different techniques. And it was quite common for the Anglo gardeners to stand outside the plot of a Southeast Asian gardener as they were working, just to see the different plants that they grew and the different techniques that they used and the different materials that they might use to trellis their crops. And often, if those women had small children there, the children growing up in the United States spoke English, and they would come and serve as our interpreters and work with us. One interesting story related to that was, at one point I was asked, again using my expertise in insect pest management, a number of the Southeast Asian gardeners were using chemical pesticides in their garden, and a lot of the Anglo gardeners were interested in organic and safe and wholesome, sustainable approaches. And they were concerned about this, particularly because when the gardeners were done with a shaker can of a pesticide, they might just drop it on the ground and it was bright yellow and red colors, and the children would play with it. And so the Anglo gardener said, we need to do something to explain to these women that this is a problem, that these chemicals are dangerous, and that the containers, even though they're empty, are still dangerous. And so I went and I gave a talk to the Hmong gardeners on beneficial insects that can help control pests and alternative methods of controlling pests that don't involve pesticides. And I had a poster that had, big poster with big pictures of all the beneficial insects that help control pests, parasitic wasps and lacewings and praying mantises and lady beetles. And obviously I was giving this talk through an interpreter. And I said, and this bug, which you've all seen, lady beetles, everyone recognizes those as beneficial insects. And I stopped, and the interpreter explained what was happening, and all of these old Hmong women started laughing hysterically. And I said, what are they laughing at? And they said, they didn't know that there was any such thing as a good bug. Every bug's a bad bug. And so we met multiple times, and despite the language barrier and despite the knowledge barrier, gradually we resolved that problem to everybody's satisfaction. So, so there are ways that community can form even despite very different appearances and challenges that you might not think that a community can form.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that is a really good example of how a form of sustainable agriculture that isn't necessarily commercial is really important and certainly central to transforming the food system when we think about accessibility to food. And I guess we will talk more about who is able to access sustainable agriculture in a little while, but let's move on to Tony.
When I first saw the title of this presentation, I struggled with it a lot because you can be an organic farmer or use sustainable methods and practice them strictly in isolation. And so I thought, really, the concept of sustainability has to be deeper. And I think when I think of sustainability, it includes two other bigger concepts, more important concepts, not just a certain set of practices which improve the ecological landscape. But those concepts are, it has to be local if it's going to create community, and it has to be of a certain scale. Because I see the community created around agriculture, especially with this renaissance, comes in two forms. One is rural communities are really suffering with the advent, as Professor Booz pointed out, the advent of industrial agriculture, because the demand for efficiency is concentrating agriculture and is wiping out these small rural communities or dramatically changing their nature. So we're from Athens, Wisconsin, which is just a half an hour away, but for its history, since it was settled and after it was logged off, it was essentially a dairy town. But because of the concentration of agriculture and all of the family farmers that are going out because of the perpetual dairy crisis and the fact that they're just not making enough money to meet their production costs, that community is being lost. And you have the replacement, and this is my favorite thing to say, what is better for our communities, for our 4-H clubs, for our FFA, our Future Farmers of America, for our Athens fairs, for our local rural culture? One factory farmer controlling 3,000 cows and exploiting 50 people who are often denied the rights and dignity of citizenship, or 50 farmers with 60 cows of their own. I think the answer is obvious. The second has that incredible intangible benefit of creating community that is being destroyed by industrial agriculture, whatever its efficiency. And Professor Booz, I don't necessarily think it's efficiency, I think is taken for granted when you concentrate, or, we have this economy of scale, so now we have this efficiency. But if you look at University of Wisconsin research on the efficiency of dairy cows on a family farm, where cows have names like Bessie, and we named our cows after dinosaurs when I was growing up, Allosaurus, Stegosaurus. But if you name your cows and you spend time with them, they produce a much greater yield of milk relative to cows on factory farms where they're production units. Okay, and they're run through something twice, probably 3 times a day, because it increases their overall yield. But family farms are, in that sense, more efficient, can provide more food. Also, when we're talking about organic, there's this big question like, oh, organic is nice, a nice little niche for yuppies to eat, but it can't feed the world. I mean, they can have that. Well, University of Wisconsin, too, not a bastion of sustainable agricultural research, is saying organic yields for corn and soy are essentially the same as conventional agriculture. And the UN Agriculture Committee did 13-year trials in Africa of organic versus conventional plots and found the organic plots to be have 126 yield of a conventional plot in a place where people can't afford the high input cost of fertilizer, pesticides that have come along with the Green Revolution. And so these rural communities can be saved and allowed to thrive through these sustainable methods. So in that sense, it creates community. In another sense is what Kat and I are trying to do is community is created between eaters and providers. We are a rural family. It's a third-generation family farm. But we're reaching out to people in urban centers, and you are allowing a family farm to thrive because of this direct relationship. And so in that sense, community-supported agriculture is exactly that. We are supported by primarily the community of Wausau, but the other small rural communities that we live close to. And so this is how people provide for us. Another thing is when food is produced locally and marketed locally, provided for locally, it is actually food. It's not a commodity which is lost between several middlemen, shipped across the country and the world, and there isn't the care or accountability that someone at the farmer's market who is growing it and providing it for someone who is going to take that home and eat it that night, because that is all lost in that commodity chain, that system, that food system that is based on profit and efficiency. And the farmer's market and events on our CSA farm, we have an all-local food pancake breakfast, a barn dance, and something called a pumpkin pick and pie as part of your subscription, but we also invite just our friends and neighbors, is a social gathering place and a scene. I think in McKibben, he loves pointing this out, and when he was here in 2007, he said, their sociologists did a study that you have 10 times the amount of conversations at a farmer's market that you would at a grocery store. Because it's not just a place to buy food, local, good, healthy, fresh food. It's a gathering place. It's a social scene where people come together and they're meeting their neighbors and they're talking with farmers about, oh, I've never seen a Sun Gold tomato in the grocery store, and the farmer will say, yeah, because they want shelf life and shippability, and a Sun Gold will split after 3 days, but it's the best tasting tomato you've ever had, and that little special exchange is what makes the experience so much more enriching. And so community is created in this respect. But then, just as a basic economic principle, sustainable agriculture that's purchased locally and practiced locally strengthens the economy of a community because of something economists call the multiplier effect. That money is recycled in the community, and those people who you're buying from, Kat and I are very adamant about purchasing locally. So we turn that over again and again. First of all, the multiplier effect, if you buy something from a local bookstore like Yankees versus a Borders, $15 of $100 will stay in the community if you buy from a Borders, and that's mostly for low-wage service sector retail work. Whereas if you buy from a Yankee bookstore, $45 of that $100 will stay in the community, giving more to Wausau, and that's more for us. Yankees will turn around and buy local services. We turn it around, buy local services from other farmers. We buy locally from the bookstore. We purchase our hardware locally. We have all our tax services locally. We're just filled up some growlers at the Red Eye Brewing Company. We care very much about giving it back locally, so that is kept in the community and strengthened. And then also, people who live in the community are dependent upon the community and interdependent upon the community and know they have to engage in it civically. So this accounts for the fact that local businesses and farms give 0.4% of their gross income on average to their local communities versus that's 4 times as much as a Walmart. And Walmart is typically giving to a local community as a political maneuver to gain some respect and put out a press release with that, whereas we're giving it away because I want to support the boys basketball team or the Athens Fair or someone who needs to raise money for a cancer treatment. And it's not just giving money, it's that we put on the bake sales, we're helping to set up these events, we're on the fair board. all these economic intangibles, which not only enhance the community, but create it in the first place. And I think that's how, in a broad manner, we focus on community. And I have some specific manners that we do, but I'm going to pass it on.
So Tony is actually writing an essay on this. When he found out that I was moderating this, he decided that this would have to be our first newsletter for our CSA farm. We write really in-depth academic newsletters, so Tony might have used all of his material because I did see the outline earlier. But Kevin, I want to pass it on to you, and I think a lot of the things that Tony was talking about in terms of the locality of business really have a lot to do with what you're doing, and so go ahead.
Yes, yes, I think so, that's true. I appreciate all the things that Tony went through on some of the details of the, you could say, the numbers of the importance of multiplier effects and other those economic intangibles, which are, I think, really super important. What I see as community is, and how that how we can engage the farmer and the eater, I think it's quite complex. And just for background, if you're not familiar, I am a registered architect, and I see architecture, and for many people, when I say that I'm a grocer and an architect, they usually chuckle because they don't see how in the world you can connect an architect with a grocer. It makes no sense. But in my world of what an architect is, it's precisely timed and tuned really together, because I see architecture really as a community builder by nature. And that is that, as an example, if you think of a church and you have to add on to a church or remodel a church, that particular church, of course, has, well, a lot of community. You have the preachers and pastors, of course, and the congregation and the church council and the building committee, and then little Jimmy in the corner who comes with mom to each of the meetings. So you add all that together, that is one big community. To figure out how can you bring that together, to have consensus, to have an ability to move forward something larger than any one person, but still an idea that would be, of course, controversial along the way of that development of what they want for the church, but yet that commonality where you can say, well, this is something we all want together. I may not agree professionally, but I can see your point, so let's just move on it. And I see that the downtown grocery is innately that same aspect of grocer as community builder. And that really, when you say inventing or bringing forth downtown grocery in really 2003, which was actually 9 months before I moved to Wausau, but knowing that I was moving here, I saw an opportunity to see that the nature of, well, in short, the architectural profession is often cyclical. So there are times where you may not have as much work. So I thought, well, what are the ways in which I could fill in my time with productive work to enhance and grow the community to have an option that they don't have. And seeing that Wausau does not have at that time, or it did without not the previous 20 years, a downtown grocery, I felt that would be really an ideal thing. Of course, I knew nothing really much about grocery selling, but it was something that I think that I could figure out. So the idea of the downtown grocery as community builder was really precisely in those monies and the time that I could bring forth, which was, I guess in the big scheme, not very much compared to other development projects, is to have a downtown grocery where those with much larger pocketbooks than I could bring forth development in the sense of townhouses and more businesses and other also food entrepreneurial activities to really grow and build really the center of town. And not that it's that suburbs are bad and downtowns are good, because I have people that I love very much that shop in suburbs. So for me to judge them and say that you are bad because you shop there, that's really not right. So we have to find that balance always, and I think that's one of the big concerns in any community building project is what is that balance, and it's not so much this or that, but it's this and that. And that's, I think, really rather important to the community building project, because I think one needs to be diplomatic and tactful and realize that there's a whole bunch of people that are really working towards the same large goal, and how could we really work with them and say that we're one big team, we're looking at it from different points of view, but how can we grow, nurture, and promote the idea of locality in food and what that means. And I think in the notion of downtown grocery, and this regards some of the sociality issues that Tony spoke of as well, is that the idea of conversation in the grocery store. And in the downtown grocery, there is often a lot of conversation, and it's really intriguing and really thrilling to hear that, because that necessarily wasn't the original intent, but knowing that food is often about conversation. So it's really just a very natural fit. And I think why this is all important is this relates again to what it means in that, what is it the things that we want, and what is it the things that we want to enjoy? Regarding some of the other panelists of the things that we eat and how that relates to community, there's this really great story by, his name is Richard Rodriguez, and he wrote an essay called Stuff. This was in 1998. It was on the PBS show. And what I think is so important, this is the social side and the community building side, I think, of what can happen in a store, such as Downtown Grocery, is the idea of really we're not so much materialistic as we think that we are. And I think as a community, what are the things that we want and what are the things that we taste? And what Richard Rodriguez suggested is that we are probably less materialistic than ever in our time frame. And of course that, while you may debate that, but what he means is that we just want stuff and not things that are material. For example, that we are probably less interested in the shape of an orange or the weight of a book, such as from Yankees, or the dark sense of a chocolate. And really, in the end, what happens is that, and this is important because we're talking about these things that happen right in front of us. And if you've ever been into Downtown Grocery, you are really overwhelmed often by onions and garlic. And I apologize if it's too much for you, but we actually cut vegetables in the Downtown Grocery. And so what Richard really suggests is that, in this regards also what Eric was mentioning too, is that I think we have too many things and too many choices. So perhaps we should limit those as we look towards the things that we want. Perhaps like the broccoli discussion, maybe we do need more types of broccoli and more types of grass-fed beef and less of our soda options so that we can, and farmers such as Stony Acres can provide those types of broccoli as well as Nine Patch with their various grass-fed beef. So what tends to happen with this is that then we really end up buying a huge bag of chocolates and then eventually eating too many. So I think in community building, Downtown Grocery, we look to not have too many choices, but definitely enough so that we can enjoy the sense of what that chocolate is or the shape of that orange, but not, of course, eat too many of them. But on the sociality or on the community building, it is then quite diverse on the questions that come about, because Tony talked about locality as well as Eric and what that means. And one big topic of discussion in the past several weeks is what do we or should we do as community in making our choices for our food? For example, we serve and have avocados, bananas, and citrus in Downtown Grocery. As you can imagine, that's a huge amount of food miles to bring that food to our store. But we also have fish from Bayfield and pickles from Green Bay and pretzels from Milwaukee. Very high philosophically, we could say that the problem with the citrus, the avocados, and the bananas is that we have to travel so far with that. Is that really economically, is that really sustainably the right choice to make because of you could perhaps say the unsustainability of those choices. At the same time, because of the fish, the pretzels, and the pickles, what are we to say to those farmers who are in our community that, we're going to stick high on our horse and not have avocados, bananas, and citrus in Downtown Grocery because we don't believe that spending those food dollars really is a sustainable choice. But then, of course, what might happen is those customers who love our pickles and our pretzels and our fish will, perhaps might go somewhere else or visit a little bit less often. And what are we to do to go to those farmers and say, we wish we could buy more from you, but our sales seem to be dropping because some people don't like our choices that we're not having avocados, bananas, and citrus in our store anymore. So in developing what it is as what is our community and how we connect the farmer to the eater, it is a whole bunch of this and that, not just this or that, in determining how best to make the choices, to have the selection, and to build the ability to make those phone calls, to buy that fish and those pretzels and those pickles, knowing though that we are making some concessions and having food that comes from way far away, and we perhaps shouldn't do it, but at the same time, I think we should.
Thanks, Kevin.
So
Craig?
I
Sorry.
guess maybe that's a short story on community and what it means to be connect our farmer to our eater.
Thank you. Craig?
For my case, the connection is really one-on-one. I extend an invitation to anyone who wants to come to my farm to see how I raise the animals. Some people take me up on that. Some, at the farmer's market, for instance, if I have pictures, some are really interested in them. They want that connection to the food that they eat. I had one young woman who brought her daughters out, and they picked out the steer that they wanted. And for some people, there's a real disconnect between, what the farmer does, what the source of the food is. So when I can establish that connection, there is that amount or a number of people who are interested in that. It seems like frequently we hear of recalls, food recalls. There's serious bacteria or contamination in them, whether it's vegetation, spinach, or in meat. And that too makes people think more locally. They think more about their food. So in cases like that, sometimes they search out and want that local food and want to be able to talk to the farmer who grew it and ask him how he grows it. And for me, that connection is something that's important. And some people, they don't want too much information. Some people, when I sell a fresh chicken on Saturday, I said, well, it was clucking yesterday. And they say, well, they don't want to hear it. That's too much information. But it's important, though. It makes, it's really that connection. Food doesn't come on little plastic platters under saran wrap in the supermarket. I said, like, why do we need farmers? You can buy that at the supermarket. So when there's that connection and there's people who are looking for it, for me, that's how it is. It's personal. It's one-on-one.
Thanks, Craig. Eric, do you have anything to say, since
Yeah,
I
I would,
cut you off for the last question?
That's right. I would echo what Craig said, and that is, for everything that my wife and I try to achieve with our little organic farm, we include an educational component. It means a heck of a lot of work for us, because we end up giving presentations all the time, workshops, we put together flyers, brochures, but I have found that when we're willing to make the educational connection, it just increases the relationship almost too much, because now people stop at our farm all the time, and I can't get anything done because they stop, and you want to be friendly to everybody, but you've got a certain amount of work to do. It started, we were very fortunate because we're just north of Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, which is a resort town with 2 significantly sized retirement communities. And so somebody put in an organic grocery store, and they found out that we were raising sheep and hogs and chickens and lots of produce. And so they asked us if we would be willing to sell at their store. And I said, well, no, not unless you allow us to do a presentation. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you keep a list of all your customers, don't you? He said, yeah, they have a flyer and a newsletter and an email list. I said, send out an email, and we're going to have a lamb roast. And we're going to put up a tent, and we're going to get a keg of beer, and we're going to hire a band, and we're going to get people inebriated and then give them lamb, and they won't know. And then afterwards, then we'll tell them, you ate lamb, and they'll say, oh, that wasn't that bad. And it's that neuromarketing that I was talking about. If you learn to control the impressions, you control the ideas. But it kind of backfired in a way, because 600 people showed up, and my wife and I agreed to provide the lamb for free. So that was a little bit expensive, but we more than recouped our costs, because so many people who had never tried lamb, I mean, let's face it, it's Wisconsin, we're beef eaters for the most part, they just loved it. They loved it, and they loved the story behind it, that it's local, that it's organic, that it's free range, that it's, grass-fed. They connected with the ideas, and it gave them a sense that they belonged to something. And I think that's a really important part, and I think that really is the community that all of us up here and all of you out there are looking for. How do we build community? Well, for me, it's the educational component. So since that very first beer party we threw where they tried the lamb, we've put on a soap making party. We keep all the lard from our hogs when we butcher, and we take that lard, and my wife is really good at making soap, and so she put on a soap making workshop, and wow, just a lot of people showed up, and it was a lot of fun, and some people probably never ever made soap again after that, but they tried it once and they're still talking about it. And so we've done a couple of those. I put on a workshop about growing tobacco, which, initially somebody came there hoping to protest because they wanted to know why a good and moral, decent being like myself would grow tobacco and contribute to the death of millions. And I just simply said, well, what's my alternative? To raise corn and let it be turned into high fructose corn syrup? And then they just stopped, and the rest of the day was great. But I didn't grow the tobacco to smoke it. I grew it because it's a natural pesticide. And so I was showing people the varieties that we have on our farm, and if you process it properly, you can turn that into just a wonderful pesticide, because bugs are highly intelligent, unlike humans. They won't go near the stuff. They won't touch tobacco. The deer don't like it. The rabbits don't like it. I mean, people go for it, but the rest of nature's somewhat more sensible. But it turned into another wonderful event, and we get some of the same people for all the things we do, and each time we get different people, and the word really gets out. And I just think the educational component is an essential component. We have to be willing to share. I know there's a time constraint, and I know also that sometimes you feel like, well, if I share all that I know, then they'll go do it themselves, and I'll be out of business. But I think that's a risk we really need to take, because it is about building community.
Well, that is a nice segue. I have my nice, neat questions, but as I predicted earlier, now people have partially answered some of them, and they don't work perfectly. But I think that the question of education that both Craig and Eric talked about and is really important for thinking about aspects of community that go past a monetary exchange. And so, in the case of, Paul working with community gardens or working with students, he's in the more righteous position at the table, although I guess he's compensated by state dollars, so we're all paying for him, and me, and Eric, to be here. But everyone else at the table is dependent to some extent on monetary exchange. And there are several people, including a sociologist, Laura DeLinde, that have commented that CSAs or other forms of sustainable agriculture are not actually real mechanisms for creating community. And I know both Tony and I have read these things and then gotten upset because we feel like, well, no, we do think that there's something genuine. But the question that she brings up in an article about CSAs in particular is that there are, CSAs offer vegetables, but they also offer farm events, or they offer educational activities. And she says, well, this is just about people wanting to buy something else. And so I think that she brings up a real question, which is the ways in which community is limited by monetary exchange, right? We have been talking here about ways in which you can build community through personal dialogue, through educational experiences, through providing new alternatives for food, in the case of Downtown Grocery, that people can't get other places, or by bringing people out to your farm, or doing talks. But she brings up that idea that I think is really important, and so we are on the thread of education, and instead of making you all talk about how you overcome those limitations, since I think you already answered that question, I would like to know how you work with consumers on education. So Eric gave a few examples, and I know there's some farmers that give out recipes and talk with people directly about preparation, but how do you work on education in the venue you're in? Because that is really central, I think, to sustainable agriculture, whether you're working within your rural community with other farmers or you're working with consumers. So anyone want to voluntarily start, so I don't have to pick on the folks? Craig?
Well, just on one point is I sell grass-fed beef. It's 100% grass-fed beef, and to some that's a new thing. So there is some education involved in just explaining the difference. And then it's like a lot of things, you know, what does natural mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything. Anybody can say their stuff is natural. And in some ways organic, or the word grass-fed becomes that to different people it means different things. So it's important not only on the consumer's part, your part, to ask, you know, what that is, but it's important on the person who's growing it to know the difference so that they can explain that. Because it really becomes something that you need to educate them on what makes it different.
And Craig, if I could follow up and pick on you. I know grass-fed beef, and I've heard you talk a little bit about having people that just love the taste, or they're like, oh, this doesn't taste like grocery store beef. What does it involve in terms of teaching people to cook? Do you do stuff in terms of recipes or giving people advice on how to actually prepare what they're cooking?
Yes, we do. It's kind of short. It's low and slow, or yeah, slow and low. So you turn the temperature down and you cook it a little slower. What you really, you know, because it usually doesn't have as much fat in the meat as the corn-fed beef, you have to cook it a little bit different so that you retain the tenderness and the moisture in the meat.
Thank you. Kevin?
Yes, on how we work to educate, it's, again, multiple different approaches. One is the more, maybe the obvious one is we have cooking classes, which are a great venue in our back kitchen. It's a very warm environment with the glass wall down, but it's very hands-on, at least in the of watching the chefs outlay, you know, 6 to 8 recipes per class, with a lot of conversation on, you know, the components of those recipes. Now, the recipes, or all the food prepared, they're all vegetarian food. With many people, it's an unusual approach. They don't quite know how they can meet all their nutritional requirements with vegetarian food only. So we see that as a great venue, as knowing that all the items that we make in our kitchen, all of it is vegetarian anyway. So to have classes that tie into the very things that we make is a really good tie-in, and with those vegetarian items, we do see, you know, great, you know, interesting comments in the summaries that the students provide on that. There were in the recent vegetarian protein class, there was several longtime vegetarians, and they stated so in their summary forms, but yet they had not had the opportunity in the past 20 years of all their vegetarian preparation to use tempeh or tofu, and we thought that was rather interesting, that to be that level of multiple years with a cuisine and not having to use two rather, you know, long time, you know, almost ancient methods of adding protein to one's diet. Another approach for education is just communication in the store. That's whether it's posters on the wall or you know, of course, you know, email newsletters, as well as Facebook. And you know, Facebook, like all things, it's not the ideal. It's not everything. One needs many different ways to communicate information. But at least the simpleness of the Facebook and limiting to you know, 4 lines of text. And unfortunately, I tend to use almost all 4 lines in each of my summaries, but I try to be brief. But it does enlighten with, you know, some, say, peppering the short descriptions with words that many people might not be familiar with. So I think part of the education role is to draw on you know, rather complex words, at the same time use them in a lively way, whether in, you know, stories in the conversation or other documentation, that, you know, provides opportunities for someone to, you know, click in their head that, well, I don't know what that is, can you tell me more? So in a lively, fun way, how can we, you know, use words which are that are really the basis of much of the discussion here, in the sense of, for example, Wendell Berry has, he likes to use words in a very short way that are descriptive. For example, he has one of my favorite lines as of late that I like from Wendell Berry, and he's a farmer, poet, philosopher from about 70 plus years old. He says that we should find ways in which the old ways of old can reshape the new. So I think, you know, in that light, what can we do? For example, I'd love to have a giant sign outside my store that says, now offering single herd, non-homogenized, glass-bottled milk. Now, many of us probably aren't familiar with those words. Those that perhaps are older remember their grandmothers and grandfathers, but I just love those words and what they mean because it defines a philosophy, a point of view, a way to meet many of the criteria that Eric outlaid earlier, in that it's descriptive in what it is. It's not necessarily efficient, but it is effective in providing a glass bottled milk that hasn't been run through a homogenization process to break apart all the globules of fat, and now you have the homogenized milk. So on education, if I can find ways to pepper more words of more interesting things, but yet have a weight and a gravity to what those words mean, I think that it can be a powerful way to provide options for people and perhaps click on a light or two of things that, not that they didn't find the time, but we're all busy with our professions and our families and such, so sometimes it takes a while to find the time or energy to look up new things. So if we can do this in a lively way with words, I think that might be, at least we see that could be an effective approach towards educating our customers.
Thanks, Kevin. Tom?
On our farm, we do a weekly newsletter, so every week you receive your vegetables, but in addition to that, basically how to use them, and we provide recipes centered around the seasonal food that you eat, and we always write about some agricultural topic. So like Kat mentioned, our first newsletter will be how sustainable agriculture creates community, and we've written about the social history of a potato, giving people a Farm Bill 101. What would Stony Acres do if it had its way with the Farm Bill? So we're commenting on these things. This season we're going to write about the food safety legislation that's being proposed by Congress and what that would mean for small producers and farmers markets such as ourselves, and who's writing it and for what ends. And then other educational things related to cooking. So the top 10 cookbooks for seasonal eating. In addition to this, Kat and I are constantly speaking at these sorts of things 4 or 5 times a year. We just presented the Master Gardeners Conference last weekend. Kat also teaches with Paul a class on the sociology and biology of organic agriculture. And so in a formal and a not so formal way, we're constantly educating people about the source and nature of their food.
When I sold my old junker cars, I made sure that people knew that they were old and junker cars. Like I said, I don't sell things,
I
so
know,
that's
Paul.
really all I had to say.
I'd like to comment on, though, Kat had this question written, and then she kind of jumped over it. But the DeLynn thing, I mean, could you say what that is
No,
again?
it's too much.
Well, anyway, DeLynn says,
Tony.
this will hurt me if I pursue this. I'll just let it go.
Paul?
Yeah, Tony mentioned the class that Kat and I taught last fall for the first time, and we'll be teaching it again next fall here, called the Science and Sociology of Organic Agriculture. And it's an interdisciplinary course because I'm a scientist and Kat is a sociologist, and a lot of students, we had 40 students sign up for the class, 20 on this campus and 20 on another campus. And I would say, what do you think? 80 to 90% of the students that signed up for the class really had no interest in agriculture when they
Correct.
took the course.
Correct.
They were taking it for the interdisciplinary studies credit, which is one of the requirements for their degree. But what was amazing about the class, because we had them introduce themselves and why they were taking the class at the very beginning. And as we went through the semester, the students, many of them, I would say we probably hooked over half of them, maybe 2/3 of them by the end of the semester, with a greatly increased interest in where their food comes from. They had never thought about how food is grown, how far it travels, who the people are that grow it, the communities that it comes from, what the community aspects are of how their food is grown and where they buy it and who they buy it from, and does it really make a difference how it's grown, whether it's grown organically, certified or uncertified, or sustainably or conventionally, or if there's GMOs in their food. And so we didn't provide them all the answers. We provided them with what evidence is available in the scientific literature and some philosophers of agriculture. But I think we were successful in increasing their awareness of what they put in their mouth. And that, I thought, was probably one of the greatest successes of that class.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, I'm going to ask somebody to tell me what time it is because I'm clearly unprepared and I can't see anything in the back of the room.
Let's take some
8:30.
questions from the audience.
So yeah, I'm going to transition into questions from the audience. I want to make sure that folks can ask questions. There are going to be 2 roving men with microphones, unless there are any women that have joined them. There's just 2 men with microphones, right? So raise your hand and they will come to you with a microphone.
Can you comment on concerns you might have about the availability of organic seed with the GMO seed and Terminator seeds and things like that?
Anyone want to take that? I'll take it.
You take it.
You know, you choose
Cat
the
buys the seeds. I stick them in the ground. No.
seeds. A little bit complicated. GMO seeds, genetically modified organisms, are really currently only available, not to say that they won't become available in other crops, but in a limited number of crops. Most of the food GMOs that you eat are in the form of canola, soy, and corn. There's also GMO cotton, and Monsanto, which is the biggest GMO producing or inventing company, does now own Seminis, which is the largest vegetable seed company in the world. So there certainly is a huge consolidation of seed companies. Currently, there is availability of a lot of non-GMO seeds, and then organic seed is, I guess, a harder thing to talk about. There are some seeds that are grown organically and available organically, but a lot of the best varieties, and Dave Peterson's sitting over here, and he grows vegetables. I'm picking on you. But he can testify in our conversation maybe after this talk to anyone that wants to ask about seed that some of the best varieties that you can grow are not available in organic seed. Just some wonderful heirloom varieties, some rare varieties because of the certification. But I think that the people should be aware of where seeds come from and who owns them. Genetically modified seeds, the genes are owned, and so farmers don't own the rights to replant those seeds, whereas both organic and non-organic, non-GMO seeds, they do. And then you also mentioned the Terminator technology. The Terminator technology was a technology that Monsanto tried to commercialize, but they faced a lot of resistance, and I do think they'll probably try to commercialize it again. But it's a technology that basically makes seed, which generally grows into plants naturally again and again, terminate its own biology. So it makes seed infertile from a plant after it's grown once. And that, I think, biologists, and maybe Paul can talk more about this, but have some serious concerns about in terms of what that means for food safety. Is that reasonable? Dave has a microphone. Who else has a microphone?
I guess I really commend you for your presentation. It's always interesting to get a different perspective, but sustainable agriculture, ecologically, sustainable agriculture, connecting communities, there's not been any discussion on whether your business model or your economic sustainability is really there, or if this is just a way of life for you.
So,
In other words, you making money at this?
Yeah, well, here's on our farm. It's definitely our primary source of income, and we're making a happy and comfortable living. We're paying ahead on the payments on our farm to buy that back. However, Kat she loves to teach, but as a lot of farmers, we call this the health insurance job. You know, someone has to work off farm because of the incredible expense. If she didn't have this source of insurance coming into us, it would equate to $14,000 annually to pay for the insurance that we're currently receiving because of the wonderful state benefits.
although we would be on Badger Care Plus,
Right.
based on the way the state values farmers now. So, but
Yeah, we would be on Badger Care, but
Yes.
we would be, you know, we're paying off the farm, and we're making a happy livelihood. Where there's 8 intensive months, but now there's 4 months where I'm taking naps and playing with my son all day, and we're watching Sesame Street and reading books and going to playgroup, and so that's also another economic intangible, is that it's a beautiful and constructive setting to raise a family that pays so many economic dividends down the line in terms of his intellectual ability and how he's going to do at school, because we have that time to give to him and read to him. So that's just, I think, another thing. But the health insurance question looms over us all the time, and Kat definitely has to teach her for that.
Anyone else on the panel want to talk about their income?
I would just say that for my wife and I, the sheep pay for the farm. They're tremendously profitable for us. We're blessed by having a niche market in our area, but we're making about $400 a head. That includes the unshorn pelt, which we process for $37 and then retail for $300. So the sheep kind of pay for the whole operation. The hogs and traditional crops are not even break even, and we do fairly well on produce depending upon weather.
Anyone else?
The downtown grocery is it is a startup business. So with a startup business, there is a large investment at the beginning, of course. But the downtown grocery, we have been able to implement initiatives and logistics and such to work to be on time with our major debts and such, and work to close accounts payable in a generally a timely fashion. Perhaps the idea of compensation for the owners isn't as much as, of course, one would want and such, but we tend to reinvest as best as we can back into the business to to play off notions of value added and what we can do with that. Just as an example, just in Europe, generally the farmers are moving towards as much value added on the farm or other initiatives that relate back to the things that they create. And I can't speak for Blaine; he's not here. But in general, I think farmers have a very tough way in the big picture. I think in that they're generally compensation in the farmers that I spoke with are obviously not where they really should be, and they're in short then not getting the respect that I think that they really deserve when you look at the long history of civilization and the importance that farmers have provided to keep the granaries filled, whether it's in with the Incas or the Sumerians, very long time ago. So and so, what can we do to help farmers to provide more options for their value-added nature of what their farms are? And in the case of Downtown Grocery, it does provide one of the owners, Blaine, with another value added from the things that he grows in his farm to complement those things that he's already providing. All right, get a short note on that.
Okay, thanks. Dave, you have one?
Just in answer to the seed question, last year out of 170 varieties of people food that I grow in my gardens, 83 were certified organic, and about 20 of them I produced myself. I'm right in the middle of the seeds this year. I think there are a few more available, but as you said, many of the best varieties just aren't available. And I get a lot of my seeds out of northern New England, Johnny's and Fedco. They had a horrible year last year, and I ordered from them in the last 2 days and found out that a whole lot of the things that are in their catalog are not available because, one of them, a hurricane blew it away. They had their whole seed stock out drying, and a hurricane blew it away. So there is progress being made, but a lot of things are difficult to find.
Thank you. That's Dave Peterson. And there are, the question of profitability, I think, is a big question. I know I'm going to pick on the organic dairy farmers in the room. You can all raise your hand. Haha, see you. I think that and certainly there's big things happening in organic dairy to limit people's ability to grow and have larger farms because of the price stability. But it depends, I think, on what area of the economy you're looking in. So if you're looking at vegetables, if you're looking at dairy, I mean, if you compare organic dairy, even with increased input prices during the incredible price crisis of the last year, far and away, organic dairy for a lot of farms was the only thing that kept people's head above water. And so in the case of dairy, organic dairy has allowed small farmers to stay in business. So has rotational grazing. Rotational grazing drops people's inputs because the cows are doing a lot of the work for them and they're not spending a lot of money on gasoline. And so for certain sustainable practices in certain systems, it creates much more economic viability. In other cases, it's very, very difficult, especially to market everything locally and make a living. And so I think there's not a blanket statement about sustainable agriculture. I think that there's many techniques and many places and different case studies to look at. But dairy is certainly an interesting in terms of Wisconsin because it has allowed 40 and 50 cow dairies to survive in an economy where they really have been bashed since the late 70s.
Yeah, to add on to that, as a general rule, the demand for sustainably produced food has allowed more family-scale farms to be profitable. Yes.
Question? I know someone back there, someone over there. Go ahead.
I had studied actually to be a doctor of Oriental medicine, and two concepts in that you actually made me think of, Eric, when you talked about the role of food in people's health. And the two concepts are, one is whole foods and the role of immunity, and then the other is seasonal attunement, where by eating foods that are actually in season, you actually tune your body in terms of like thickening the blood to winter and thinning the blood in spring, and thereby are less prone to illness. Do you see a lot of people picking up on that in the sense of whole foods and health and just seasonal and health?
Anyone?
Definitely when we started our CSA in 2007, the book Omnivore's Dilemma just came out, and I said it must have sold half our CSA shares. And so because of the popularity of this conversation right now, not only with that book, but In Defense of Food, and then Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle, and just the conversation, Time Magazine had an article in it last week that said how cows, grass-fed only, can save the planet. Just because of all the things that are coming to the forefront right now in regards to sustainable production being kind of sexy or trendy. I hope it's not just a trend or a fad. But people are looking for it because of that conversation is happening. That's why farmers markets are growing and booming. And yeah, generally because there's this conversation and movement going on at the same time. That's why our CSA is successful, I think.
Anyone else want to comment on the whole foods or the season?
I guess my experience with that is that there always will be, there are some who have always made use of food that's available in abundance seasonally. I think it goes in families. My grandmother, when she died, we cleaned out her cellar. There were 500 quarts of vegetables canned. That's just what they did. And, gallons of vinegar and gallons of everything else. So there's always some, and hopefully people, as they think more about agriculture and what they're eating, you just know you can't buy tomatoes year-round. You make use of them when they're there, when they're seasonal.
And I think the other thing in terms of your question of whole foods is the degree to which we've had people approach us who have serious health problems who've been told by doctors or alternative medical professionals to eat whole foods, right? We have had people who have been diagnosed with cancer, people who have immune system problems who are told by their doctors, you have to eat whole foods, you have to eat meat and fresh vegetables, and that's what you have to eat because otherwise your body's not going to be able to take this. And so I think that there are people who come through different health crises, at least in terms of what we've seen on our farm, who approach us for those reasons. But usually it's because of something being wrong. Mm-hmm. Another question.
I'm delighted that there are so many people interested in locally grown things and like to make bread and love to eat desserts. Eric, very responsibly, I will admit, though. Where do you get locally grown grains, flour, oat, that is organic? I don't hear about it.
It is, and maybe Kevin can comment on what they have at Downtown Grocery, but grain is one of the, Craig and us process animals actually fairly close to where we live. There's small processors of meat, but this has been meat processing has been a major crisis in Wisconsin. Some people are just very, very far away from processors. Grain processors, in terms of grain for human consumption, are much, much, much more consolidated. And so in the state of Wisconsin, there's some artisan level stone grinders that people have, and we have friends in western Wisconsin that have that, and have one that they use just for farm use and selling to people locally for bread. But then medium-sized grain processing, which is basically what you would probably be looking for, where there would be farmers that would be selling stuff to a granary and people would be able to buy 50-pound bags of grain, is really hard to find. And I think in terms of where we are right now, the best thing that you could do if you really would like that is approach individual farmers, and ask them if they will grow stuff from you. The problem is that an acre of barley is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and it's very hard to grow small grains on a very small scale, and to harvest them on a small scale. And so there are people, our neighbor rents land from us and uses it to grow organic grains for Organic Valley mainly, but you need, it's hard to find those people, but that also involves cleaning and grinding your own grain. So right now the infrastructure is incredibly limited around grain, even more so than any other sector of processing.
It's one of the things that disappeared with the consolidation of agriculture, frankly, and there is a renaissance going on, but it's hard to find.
Yeah, there are a couple of, there's one, I believe near Stevens Point, where we spoke with them about a year ago on options for seeking some of the grains that they had. So it is limited, but one and it touches on both education and community as discussed previously, is that what can we do to, you could say, assist farmers in providing the opportunity to know that there's enough interested parties to then make the forage, you could say, to begin grain production that would be profitable for them, as well as seek the or supply the local supply, or supply the local demand. And for example, one thing that Downtown Grocery is very interested in would be finding finding Gretchen and her granola, and then Betty and her bakery. And these are individuals, I don't know who they are, I've never tasted their products, but who are these people out there where we can assist them? And Downtown Grocery at the forefront has a kitchen incubator project where we were seeking individuals who could rent our kitchen when we're not in use. And I'm pleased to announce right at the moment that just today we have our first incubator, you could say, student or food entrepreneur who will start in about 2 weeks of making gluten-free products. And why that's important and relates to your question is that that's one step towards something larger, where now if we have the new gluten-free bakery, and then we find Betty and we also find Gretchen, that how many others can we find to then allow the farmer that's near Stony Acres, for example, to perhaps move not only towards Organic Valley, but say processing things locally, where maybe there's a cooperative processor for human consumption grains. So I think there's options and opportunities, but like with much of life, it is complex and it takes a while. But I think continual questions like that to instill opportunities for those that are out there that feel that maybe perhaps this is what I'd like to do, is be Kevin's Gretchen and or his Betty, and make his and find sources to rent a kitchen, to make bakery or their granola. So I think there's options and there's possibilities that like most things, it does take time.
Maybe we'll take one more question and then we will head into our conversation room. Feel free to grab any of us. If you're a farmer in the room, will you raise your hand? There's many of you. Yeah, we have some great local farmers. The Beckers, I'm giving them a shout out. They raised their hand. They're in the center of the room. They have lamb that they don't direct market, but I think they got a good idea of how to sell lamb to people tonight. But Dave Peterson in the front grows vegetables. Joelle and her family produce milk. Paul Nearing in the back has beef. Who else raised their hand? Will, who was in Paul and I's class, is from a dairy farm. Anyone else I'm missing? Okay, well, we really appreciate, this is like the highest density of sustainable farmers in the state. I'm just kidding. But definitely at any one UWMC event. One more question, or anyone? Will, and then we're gonna head into the back.
Now, like back in the day where the organic farming was the same, and then now we sway towards conventional farming. Now, there's such demand for organic farming. Has like organic farming as in a philosophy and economic term, has it brought back its taste or more popularity in today's world? And is there more improvement in it?
Well, I'm going to take a stab at Organic Valley through the late 90s, early 2000s was growing at 20% a year. Even in the recession, there's still some growth, although they've stopped accepting new farmers because of the concern. Am I right? Is that ban still on in terms of new producers? But there's still some growth. So even with this recession, and there's this idea that organic is elitist and it's only for a certain affluent class of people, it's still growing. And more people try organic products, purchase them regularly as a greater percentage of the population every year. And so there's definitely a growing and expanding interest. And just it's at the center. One of the newsletter stories Kat and I wrote last year was why we certified organic. And basically we did, even though we don't need to, because we direct market everything locally. We want people to come out and see our farm. It's a cost to us. We don't need to do it, but we feel that the O word, and whether it's meaningful or corrupt or not, is at the center of people's attempt to make a more humane, ecological, family farm-centered food economy, and we need to support that idea. And so it's still growing despite the recession, and it gives me a lot of hope for creating a different ecological and agricultural landscape.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate your presence and hope you can join us next week at the next WIPS event. We'll be around in the cookies and milk and juice and coffee room. Thank you. Oh, yes, fill out your green forms. Fill out your green forms.